from Mayor Mike Duggan. I'm Devin Scillian, joined now by Nolan Finley from the Detroit News, Stephen Henderson from the Detroit Free Press. And let's talk first about takeaways. Stephen, what was your thoughts on what you heard tonight?
Well, I mean, it was a very long speech.
It was that.
Covered a lot of ground.
Yes.
You know, I thought he did well up front, just saying, look, we had a lot of work to do in this city. Every neighborhood is not feeling the recovery that I hope to achieve here, and I think that's really important because there are a lot of people who are starting to ask questions about when is my neighborhood gonna benefit from this? When are things gonna be different?
Apparently, we had 4 of those people in the room tonight interrupting. Yes.
Pretty upset about some of the things that still are going on in the city. I thought it was real smart to acknowledge that up front, give some space to that, and then talk about the things that he's really focused on doing. I've said for a while, a lot of what he's doing is long-term stuff. It's not going to pay off in the short term. People are going to have to wait, but that's a really hard message to get to people who have been waiting for decades.
Patience is a tough ask at this point. Nolan, what are your takeaways?
Yeah, and I mean, that's his job. It was a pep talk. It was quite a pep talk. And he is speaking to the people. He was speaking to the people who, you know, are fed up or on the verge of fed up, and he's saying, hey, trust me, give me a little while longer. Things are getting better. And I think his job was to show progress or to emphasize progress, and I think he did that.
Let's go through. He gave us 5 priorities that he believes tonight, and so let's take each one of those here as to frame our conversation. First, on crime, Stephen, he did point to some success that we're seeing, a couple of precincts where crime is way down, especially one where we might not expect it to be. Also, this camera initiative in some gas stations seems to be paying dividends.
Yeah.
He can point, but you still got a lot of residents who are scared of their own neighborhood.
Right, and crime is too high.
Yeah.
There's no question. If you live here, you put up with an inordinate amount of crime. That still is about the size of the police force in a lot of ways. People's fear is about response times, and if something happens to me, how quickly can I get help? We're doing better on that, but until you can hire a whole lot more officers, I think you're not going to move the needle on that quite the way that people expect. He did say they expect to hire 200 more officers this year, but that only gets you to about 1,700. You're still talking about that number over 140 square miles and 650,000 people or whatever. I mean, we don't have enough officers.
Which is interesting too, Nolan, given these new initiatives that you talked about tonight. First, we're going to go after the more than 1,000 people who have outstanding warrants. We're going to start arresting people for illegal, for scrapping rather than just giving them tickets.
Which is an important initiative, but not, you know, that's important for the sort of development of the city and blight control. The policing elements, the public safety elements, I mean, you're only going to do so much with policing. And it's good to beef up, and it's good to crack down on the fugitives. It's good to send a message that you can't get away with murder or any other crime in Detroit. But you also have to start attacking the causes of crime and sort of some of the cultural issues. And he talked a little bit about that, working with young people to try to instill that respect for life and respect for property and the respect for their own future. You've got to give these kids hope. You've got to give them a better education, a future, and so all of these initiatives tie in together in that way in terms of the whole of public safety issue.
In fact, let's skip ahead to number 3 on his list because it ties into where we're talking, which is jobs. He talked about this initiative to try and get more businesses to hire young people, but as soon as he said it, I got a tweet from somebody who said, look, just drive around Detroit. Anybody almost over the age of 21 is right now very unemployable in their city.
Yeah, you know, this is a pretty interconnected problem in the city. It connects to schools, right, where we're not preparing people for the workforce. It connects to the sprawl that has affected, the job sprawl that has affected this region, has taken jobs out of the city into the suburbs. You know, Brooks Patterson talked last week about expanding I-75 to grow even more jobs in the suburbs. Not a bad thing, but when you talk about where people in the city are going to work, you got to start thinking about these things a little more in a little more depth. I've always said that as mayor, your ability to get people jobs is really, really minimal. It's limited.
And altruism is just a short-term answer. It's a Band-Aid, if you will. You've got to start growing jobs in these neighborhoods, and that's why the small business discussion, encouraging small business, encouraging local people to open businesses in these commercial strips. That's where teenagers get jobs. And you know, to rely on the business community to hire kids they don't really need just out of the goodness of the heart, I think a lot of them will do that, but they're not going to do that year after year after year. You've got to create a market demand for this labor. I would suggest a sort of special wage rate in Detroit for kids, for first-time hires in certain businesses. Anything you can do to create a demand for labor and make labor affordable will help these kids.
I know you love that kind of talk,
no,
Stephen.
I don't. That's not what we need.
Then come up with another way of addressing the issue.
I think you work in combination. I mean, you have to create job centers again in the city, right? And that's not just about wages. That's also about density, demand for product. The city is emptied out in a way that most neighborhoods wouldn't be jobs.
It's about placemaking.
And those are things that we have done as a region quite poorly, right? We've incentivized people moving moving density to the suburbs as opposed to into the city. You've got to start turning that stuff on its head, and I don't necessarily think that low wages for kids
except
are
that
the
you've
way
got a lot of
it.
marginal businesses in the city, a lot of people just barely hanging on, just meeting their monthly expenses. If you start forcing higher wage rates on them without increasing productivity, I think a lot of these kids are going to suffer.
Yeah, well,
if you had a special entry-level rate for teenage workers, you could at least get them into the labor force and start them on their path to a future.
And the mayor's bigger point there was to show them engagement where they're making a paycheck. Show them what it's like to be responsible, to go show up every day. You change somebody's life that way. Right. On what we're talking about, I just got a tweet from Pat McGinnis. It says, Duggan makes me feel that it's time to move to the city, but only private sector will seal the deal. And that's really what you're talking about, creating those kind of opportunities.
You've got to have more jobs and more job centers in neighborhoods. When I was a kid in Detroit in the 70s and 80s, most neighborhoods still had not just an auto plant or a supplier, they had a lot of small businesses around that don't exist anymore, and the density that supported those is gone.
Let's move back to the one we skipped a second ago on these priorities, Nolan, blight. It's always interesting when you hear the mayor talk about the comparison, to say we've knocked down 6,000 structures, and that's more than the 1,000 they did in the entire state of Ohio. I always think, well, should I be impressed or should I be depressed at the need that was clearly there?
Well, and at the task ahead, there's 45,000 of these homes that need tearing down, and 4,000 was a big number. But think about, that's 10 years it'll take to clear out the inventory if we don't get any more abandoned homes. And there's a feeling that at 4,000 a year, you may just be keeping pace with the ongoing abandonment.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this mayor has made a priority of trying to up that number and go faster to close that window, right? So that you're not taking 10 years. I don't know how close they are to that. Of course, the questions about cost overrun at some point diminish the number of houses you can knock down. If you're paying more per house, you can't do as many. It is a huge boon, though, to this idea that he has, that he's gotten this $2 billion nationwide for more demolition. That is a huge win that was driven by the city of Detroit. It was driven by the state of Michigan, and a lot of that money, some of the numbers I've seen in terms of hundreds of millions of dollars that will come to Detroit to do it, will help us go faster than we have been.
Number 4 on his list was car insurance. I suppose if you live in another city, to think of a mayor saying that that's a priority to fix car insurance, it's really difficult, I think, for some people to grasp the enormity of the problem here, Nolan. And no fault is failing the city of Detroit for these weird medical reasons, really, that the mayor keeps pointing out that I don't really seem to have a whole lot to do with car insurance.
Well, no, and getting that passed through the legislature. You notice he was really buttering up the legislature throughout.
He did, yes.
Because he needs their help on a number of these things, including the de-insurance. I doubt de-insurance will pass without a statewide bill. I don't think they're going to carve out Detroit and provide Detroit relief, and that's caught up in a huge lobbying effort, a lot of friction. But we were talking off camera while the mayor was giving his speech. There's a lot of reasons for these high insurance rates. De-insurance may lower the rate marginally, but you really have to attack these lawsuits and the medical lawsuits. The 1-800 I'll sue you is really having an impact on insurance rates in the city of Detroit.
Yeah.
And we got to figure out a way to get these predatory lawyers off the streets.
Yeah, I mean, the Detroiters are being victimized by a number of different people in this issue. It is insurance companies who I think are overcharging, and no question, when you look at the rates that people pay in the city. But then you've got these lawyers who have come in and taken people who've been in accidents and sort of promised them all kinds of things that cost a lot of money in terms of medical reimbursements, and that is a legitimate driver of costs.
Well, and to the mayor's way of thinking, the way he described it now, you've also got some unscrupulous healthcare providers who, once they find out there's an auto attached to this,
right,
ding, the meter's running.
That's right.
That's right.
And, you know, charging for everything from, you know, lounge chairs to acupuncture to all sorts of crazy stuff.
I mean, that's what's driving. They've determined that's what's driving the cost higher. The insurance is a way to sort of take that out of the picture for some people, but it also looks to a lot of people like a second-class insurance plan, right?
That's the problem, isn't it? Yeah.
It's not enough money.
No, it's better if you're driving on nothing, which we have, as he said, where the law right now is forcing a lot of people into lawlessness, and that's lousy.
It's an improvement over that.
But is a savings of a couple $100 on a $5,000–$6,000 policy worth the risk that you might have?
If you get hurt,
insurance
if you get really hurt, the insurance is not going to pay enough to get you better.
Lastly, and I thought it was a classic case of saving the toughest for last, getting his hands around what's going on with Detroit public schools. He said he believes that that the state is on the hook for the deficit they've run up, and he believes that everybody has come to that understanding. I'm not sure. Is that they pretty much have?
Yeah, I think they have. Whether they've come to the reality that they've got to go ahead and settle this debt without tying huge ropes around the money, I think that's where the debate is in Lansing. I think both the House and Senate agree we've got to pay, the state's got to pay that debt. The Senate would return local control with some caveats. The House wants to keep them bonded to the state for another 8 years. I don't see that as a good solution. I think the best thing they can do right now in Lansing is get the state, pay the debt off, get the state out, let the local community run the schools, make sure parents have plenty of choices if the schools fail to do their job.
And I understand the desire for accountability by these outstate legislators, Stephen, who are frankly tired of having Detroit's problems in front of them. I'm sure that's true. But to suggest another 8 years, what do we have at the last 6 to 15 to recommend that?
Yeah, nothing at all. I mean, it just hasn't worked. State intervention has been sloppy, it has been inefficient, and it's made a lot of the problems that we had before the state came in. And of course, we had a lot of problems before the state got here. It's one of the things people tend to forget, that the schools were a mess for a long time in Detroit. But the state's made those problems look bigger. So there's just no credibility attached to this idea of 8 more years of state involvement. There's also less credibility, frankly, in the Senate plan that just is punitive. I mean, it's saying, well, we'll do this, but we'll punish Detroiters, we'll punish teachers, we'll punish the school district. I'm sorry, that's the House plan. That really just comes out of nowhere.
They've taken their whole wish list and applied it just to Detroit.
Just to Detroit.
Things they haven't been able to do statewide. And you know, we editorialized against that. We thought it was apples and oranges, and that it was unfairly singling out the city. But I mean, let's be clear. Just simply returning this back to local control is no panacea.
Well, and I thought it was really interesting the way the mayor talked about the importance of that election. Right, that we can, with enough time, that we can get a field of candidates, a good field of candidates, good enough to manage the schools differently than before. That is a huge promise to make.
I believe you tweeted that out during the address.
And I'm not certain,
can we guarantee qualified candidates?
I'm not certain that I would have made that kind of pledge if I were the mayor. Given the history of school board elections going horribly awry back when I was covering schools in the early 90s in Detroit. I mean, the stories I was writing about candidates and elections were a mess. The idea that we would go back back to that and think that something would be different, I still haven't seen what will make it different this
But,
time.
you know, we did end up with a fairly decent council this time.
We did.
I think you have to put that same sort of energy, and, you know, our friend Sheila Cockrell from Flashpoint and Irv Reed at Wayne State, working on developing candidates, developing community awareness. You can't go back to school board like the ones we've had in the past where you had an illiterate pervert serving as president. I mean, that's dooming children. And so if you want local control and if you want it to work, you've got to do a better job of picking leaders.
But I guess my question is, what's the mechanism the mayor uses to get those candidates? That's
it's a bully pulpit.
It's a big ask.
It's the bully pulpit.
Let's wrap it up, though, by mentioning what I described it as an ecumenical address. It was interesting, the outreach. First off, not only introducing all of the council members, but kind of giving each of them an identity. Also mentioning both President Obama and Governor Snyder a couple of times together, mentioning Candace Miller, the Republicans in Congress who helped with money for more of the demolitions. I mean, the outreach was noteworthy.
Well, he's a guy who understands he needs a lot of help from a lot of different places. He needs the Snyder administration on this blight effort in particularly. He needs the legislature on some of these other things we've talked about. He needs Congress. He understands that Detroit can't stand alone, and you know, you can't alienate a whole lot of people and get what Detroit needs.
Well, one of the ironies is, who was the person who first really talked about this in the state of Michigan, this sort of no blame, no credit kind of governance? It was Rick Snyder, who you know, self-immolated over the Flint thing. But now you see Duggan sort of moving into that space saying, I don't care whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, I don't care whether you're from the city or the suburbs, you can help us get to this better place, and I need you to do it.
He did throw Kevin Orr under the bus, right?
He did, yes. He had some help because apparently that was what some of the protests were about. Others were apparently complaining about. I was talking with Portia Roberson, who was there, because we couldn't always understand what people were yelling. Some of the others were complaining about poverty and water shutoffs. So, fascinating night. Thank you both very much for your thoughts on it. We will look forward to reading your columns on it. Nolan Finley from the Detroit News, Stephen Henderson from the Detroit Free Press, and of course they will be back, no doubt, very soon on Flashpoint. Thanks for being with us here on ClickOnDetroit.com. We'll see you back here tonight for Local 4 News at 11.